Barriers to provider status. It's not the enemy that you think. Hey, my name's Alex, and today we're going to be jumping into provider status and if it's really the hope that pharmacists should have in the future of our profession. Let's jump in. Akira is a Japanese 1988 film that focuses on a futuristic Tokyo on the brink of civil unrest. The film focuses on Akira, a boy from the slums who stumbles into a government experiment gone wrong. The film focuses on the narrative of what happens when machines and humans intermix and the unforeseen consequences of what powerful people want to happen and the backlash against those who have no control over their circumstances. Akira, the boy who you've come to sympathize in the beginning of the story, makes poor decisions as he comes to terms with his newfound power. And Akira presents really interesting questions. What happens to mankind when we gain power? What changes happen when we gain this power to us and to those that are around us? And unfortunately, what are the unforeseen circumstances that can happen when we gain that power? Everyone loves the story of the little guy taking on the big corporation and bringing down those powers that be to bring justice. And I like those stories, right? It's great to have a great evil to fight that we want to vanquish and say, okay, I am going to change things. But once we get into power, things become different, don't they? Pharmacy is in a similar process of change. I've recently spoke with a pharmacist who was 72 years old, and he commented on how even when he was in school, that they had been talking about provider status for pharmacists. This is a drum that everyone has heard over and over again. And what I think this conversation is about is power, actually. Because we as pharmacists feel like we don't have power when it comes to the changes that have been happening in our profession. And what the narrative is about provider status is that it's the golden goose. Once we have provider status, things are going to change is the narrative that we hear. We're going to be able to charge for services. We won't be tied to a product anymore. We'll be patient-focused instead of product-focused. And oh boy, what a bright future it will be, right? APHA has a great webpage that describes the journey that we've been on as pharmacists seeking provider status and where we are today with the legislation and the opportunities presented to us as pharmacists. And there are enemies of us receiving this power. Currently, the legislation isn't in place, right? Well, we know that we have to convince legislators of that ability. And what I'll share with you is what I've been hearing from both sides of the aisle. We know that there are two major voices for representing pharmacists, ASHP and APHA, both good organizations in their own right. But I've had people from both organizations tell me on separate occasions that when they speak with legislators, the legislators look at them and they say, until you have one message, one group telling us what it is that you want, we will not listen. Now, I think there's a little bit of fabrication in there, but I mean, it makes sense, right? We look to our partners in healthcare. The doctors have the AMA, one organization to represent all of the doctors, and then many subgroups that are a part of that group. FIP, the International Pharmaceutical Federation, is the global body that represents pharmacy, and they are one global body. There is no other global body that exists on the same level as they do. They represent all of us, and they have multiple subgroups of the various different niches of pharmacy. That is what I think many pharmacists wish we had, was one body to represent all of us. So in a way, we are our own enemy because we're not getting a clear message straight, not just to the public, but also to legislators. Additionally, the other enemy we have is the AMA. They have gone on record to say on multiple times that giving us provider status is not the way forward. But those are the typical enemies, right? I mean, it's always the big bad guys, right? The ones with all the power. They're not cooperating. There's politics. People are fighting. And it's the leaders, right? They're the ones who are the enemies. Well, after doing some digging, I believe that, yes, they do present a problem, but I think the real problem may be the one that's right in front of our faces. Let me ask you a question. Let's pretend for a moment we look into the future and we want to see what would happen to us if we received provider status. Well, we can't do that, right? We don't have a crystal ball. I wish, right? I kind of want to call a tarot card service just to get my reading because I know it's bogus, but that's just, I don't know, secret wish. But what if we could look at other countries around the world where pharmacists have provider status? Could we maybe see what they're doing? Well, in 2014, APHA wrote an article about Canada and the UK, where pharmacists have provider status in various forms. Today in Canada, most provinces have laws that expand pharmacy's scope of practice to some form of prescribing authority. And in the province of Alberta, only 10% of pharmacists have that prescribing authority. In the UK, in 2000, pharmacists and nurses were given authority to dispense emergency contraceptives under physician-signed prescribing protocol. By 2010, only 2 or 3% of pharmacists have provider status. In my opinion, the enemy is ourselves. I find it hard to believe that once we attain pharmacy provider status, that every pharmacist is going to jump on board. And there's actually some literature to support this. I mean, not only the evidence of what the other countries do where pharmacists are practicing at that level, but also I think it goes back to our psychology. One article by Frankel and others points out this fact. The article is entitled Responsibility and Confidence, Identifying Barriers to Advance Pharmacy Practice. Quote, pharmacists feel neither responsible nor confident for their clinical decisions in ambiguous situations due to social, educational, and personal reasons. A conclusion that one could draw from this is that once allowed, pharmacists don't want to practice at an advanced level. Now, I obviously don't think that this conclusion is true for all pharmacists. But if you think about it, by and large, pharmacists, we are not decision makers. It was interesting that I got to meet one of the leading researchers on this subject, a psychologist and a pharmacist, Dr. Austin Zubin at APHA. And in his presentation, he actually talks about the personality of the pharmacists at great detail and length. And he described this interesting picture that I had formed in my mind, but I didn't have the research to prove that by and large, we as pharmacists, we don't love making those tough decisions. We love our protocols. We love our guidelines. We love following our regimens and seeing, okay, how much do we need to increase the dose by? Let's look at the chart. Let's look at the guidelines, because if we don't follow that, then we're breaking the rules. We as pharmacists would rather have medicine be a science than an art. Dr. Zubin talked about in his presentation that he did research on pharmacists who had made the transition to become medical doctors. And in his study, he found what was so interesting in these interviews, that these pharmacists had said the most difficult part wasn't the studying, wasn't the material, it wasn't even the practice. It was the psychological switch in their brains to become hardline decision makers rather than passive suggestions as they had learned to do as pharmacists. Is it nature or nurture? Zubin again asks this question in the Canadian research article, where he's asking the question, is it because of who we are as people, as pharmacists? Are we just attracting people who don't like to be the leader, the hard decision makers? Or is it the way that we train pharmacists that leads them to become these supportive type roles in the healthcare system? And the answer probably is both, right? We're not on the front lines. I don't think pharmacists want to be that. We don't like attention on ourselves. We want to be behind the counter. We want to be protected. That's what we were sold, right? As pharmacists, when we were students, we thought 6 Gs, and we get to be behind a counter. We get to advise people, give them advice. We get to teach them. It's not something really hands-on. It's not something where we're always making tough decisions in not very clear situations. That isn't us. But as providers, we're going to be put in those situations more and more. And pharmacists will be forced to get more expensive liability insurance because of the extra added responsibilities that will be placed on us. And my thinking here is that as pharmacists, I don't believe many people are going to want that added responsibility. Based on the research and the acceptance of becoming a provider in other countries, and just looking at the psychology of us as a profession, I have a hard time believing that once we gain that status, which I think it is inevitable at a certain point, it's going to happen nationally in our country, that everyone is going to be on board and we're all going to rally together and sing Kumbaya and go, yeah, we're going to do services. We're going to be pharmacists doing this stuff. I think it's going to slowly happen over time. I think many people are not going to jump on that bandwagon. And I think the future of pharmacy has to change the way it's messaging to the next generation. Granted, I know a lot of people are going to be like, boo, no, don't send more pharmacists to us. We don't need, our market is full. We don't need them. And they're right. We are in a flooded market, but we have to replace us, right? We have to inspire the next generation to be great, because otherwise we're just getting, mediocre pharmacists coming out. So we need great people to join us, and we need to shape that message around what is a pharmacist? What do we do? And I feel like with provider status, that changes what a pharmacist does in a big way. And it almost means that we need to be focused on a different kind of person that comes to our profession. If we're becoming not rule followers anymore, but decision makers, well, that means that's a completely different person, right? I think the typical pharmacist would agree with me to say that we love processes, we love protocols, we want to follow them, we want to make sure we dot every I, and as we should, because we're the last line of defense before the medicine reaches the patient. And if we aren't vigilant, then we're not doing our jobs. So to change that, to change the makeup of a person, to say, well, we need them to be more flexible, adaptable, and goal-oriented and decision-driven. That's a different person, right? It's not the same. So we're in kind of this flux of, where do we go? How do we change the way we think? If our psychology and our makeup is meant to be a rule follower, then how do we change people to become decision makers in ambiguous situations, as the research article quoted? I'm not sure how we do that. That's why I think that as pharmacists, we are our own worst enemy to provider status. But I do think it's important, as does Daryl Schiller.
So I think that provider status, if it's something that's achieved, and pharmacists can be included in the Social Security laws as healthcare providers, it creates an opportunity for pharmacists to be involved in the decision-making process.
As Daryl said, it gets us to the negotiation table. And if we don't have a seat at the table, then, well, we don't have a say in how things are run, which kind of sounds familiar. I think if any pharmacy especially in like the hospital setting. I think we can agree that sometimes we feel left out of a lot of the decision making. We have to assert ourselves to be heard in the hospital setting, and sometimes it's difficult for us. It's not in our nature to be heard all the time. I don't want you to come away from this and think, man, should we even do this? I think we should. I think we do need to pursue provider status. I think it would be great if our major organizations could come together peacefully and push this legislation forward in a combined effort so that we can be more effective, guys. I mean, come on, let's get going. Our other countries have already had this for years, decades now. We can do it. We should be able to. We should be the leader in pharmacy. But yet it's not happening. And pharmacists, we all should want this ability. It would make us more valuable in the marketplace. It makes us more valuable for companies. They can make more money if this happens. But we have to acknowledge that I think training has got to happen for many people, not just on how to do it, but to put themselves in a psychologically safe space to be a provider, because it's going to be scary. The majority of pharmacists are not used to be doing these things, and they're going to be scared to take on this added responsibility and liability. But for you in the next generation, I'm excited for you. It's a bright future of what we can do, and I want you to be a part of it. Look, the future is unclear as to when this is going to happen, how it's going to happen, and how pharmacists will provide those services. But if you want to set yourself up for success, now is the time to do so that when the change happens, you are the one who's prepared and you can be the one that leads the charge. So the way to do that is by joining our course, our community of other pharmacists who are wanting to make the best of their career. Go to thehappypharmd.com/start to start your journey towards a better career. Thanks for listening to this podcast and just listen to me rant about this. This is not going to be a popular perspective. I know, I'm probably going to get some backlash on it, and that's okay. I think this is something that we need to acknowledge as pharmacists. If we don't pinpoint this, and if we don't look at this problem and say, hey, I think buy-in's going to be pretty low, then we need to start making steps now to get pharmacists ready for the future. Thank you for listening to this podcast. I have been your host, Alex Barker, with the Happy PharmD, and I look forward to hanging out with you in this next episode.